continue looking in church history, and we've been looking at isms and options and orthodoxies, and we're going to continue looking at this morning what's referred to as the Pietist option, and this is from Volume 2 of Gonzalez's book, Chapter 22, so if you want to follow along there. And this is one of those quote-unquote options which probably come a lot closer to being what we might consider a balanced approach, or more balanced approach, because all of us are going to wobble one way or another. But the Pietists actually come up with some pretty solid things that we're far more familiar with and actually far more comfortable with. And it actually becomes out of a reaction. As we've seen in church history and as history in general, people tend to react. And the Pietist movement is going to come along with an understanding that, again, like I said, is a little bit more balanced. And if you remember in Lutheran orthodoxy, if you will, the emphasis is on salvation by faith. And it starts off that way, but it becomes more and more associated with biblical ideals, observance of ordinances, and morals. Now, there's nothing technically wrong with any of that, but it becomes sort of cold and sterile and academic, and it's sort of come, show up, listen, go, and any theological stuff is the heady knowledge with not a lot of heart to it. Not saying that the people weren't believers, but it just sort of wandered off into that direction. The spiritualists, as we talked about before, they kind of went, well, the Spirit's in us, we have everything we need, Christ is dwelling in us, and who needs the Bible really? So it's just kind of every man, woman, child for themselves. And they kind of wandered off the beam. There's nothing to hold them on track, even though they are trying to say, yes, the Spirit is going to lead and guide, which is a good thing. But when it supersedes the Scriptures, we got a problem. Then we have the rationalists, and the rationalists aren't evil. Let's just start with, they becomes more evil, but they're trying to say, look, God gave us a brain. Let us use the brain that God gave us. Let us think about things. Let's reason about things. Well, what happens is as soon as man's standards start taking over in that rational argument, God's standards kind of go out the window. So people are no longer looking to God's standards, but to man. Well, once that happens, we know where man's standards go. They're not good, even though they're trying to say, yes, we need to think about stuff. It's not just all woo spiritual stuff. It's not just about orthodoxy. It's about thinking. Well, and then we come to the Pietists. And the Pietists, their emphasis is going to be on the need for a believer to continue to follow Christ, not just the salvific part. Now, let me put this in context for you, because I think we even fall into this trap today. When we think about salvation by faith, we go, yay, salvation, yay, justification. And we get all excited about sending missionaries out, and we get excited about people being saved. How excited are we, though, about people living a godly life, following Christ? Not just being saved by Christ, but following Christ from the moment they're saved onward. Do we get as excited about that? Look, that person lived a godly life this week. Or is it just, look how many baptisms we have. Look how many people were saved. Look how many things this missionary reached out to. What about the godly life that goes along with it? Are we excited about that? Are you excited about it in your life? Am I excited about it in my life? See, as the Amazing Grace of the hymn goes, it's grace that's led me safe thus far, and what? And grace will lead me home. It was saved by grace, live by grace, and walk by grace our whole life. And this is where the Pietists start saying, look, the doctrine in your head ought to affect your heart and therefore your life. And this is where they sort of react, if you will, to a lot of this cold orthodoxy, this spiritualism, or this overheady thinking rationalism. Now, this would be a natural progression, wouldn't it? If you start thinking about it, Luther and a lot of the reformers are kind of running for their lives, or fighting the battles of, hey, we need to make sure people are saved and they have the right doctrine. But in time, those guys would probably come up with even better understanding of sanctification, not just justification. And the reality is, John Calvin had a little bit more time on his hands that wasn't running for his life than Martin Luther did. And in some of Calvin's Institutes, he writes a little bit more about this. Let me read this. This is on page 2 of your notes. and this, I'm just going to read an excerpt from what's in the notes. It says, God works in his elect in two ways: inwardly by his Spirit, outwardly by his word. By his Spirit illuminating their minds and training their hearts to the practice of righteousness, he makes them new creatures. While by his word, he stimulates them to long and to seek for this renovation. In both, he exerts the might of his hand in proportion to the measure in which he dispenses them. In other words, Calvin got the idea that he said, look, God's Spirit is both in his word and internally. He takes his word and he applies it internally, and that you're going to live out your life that's going to be consistent with that word. And so he doesn't fall off the beam too far. Now, people after him may have got a little bit heady, but at least Calvin did see this. Probably Luther did too. He just didn't have as much time to write it down and talk about it. But sanctification becomes the issue. And again, orthodoxy, spiritualism, rationalism all have elements of goodness, but they also lead you off the path of that balance. And this is where the Pietists again come in. So the first one we're going to talk about a guy named Philip Jacob Spener. And Spener was born in Alsace. He was born between the border between modern-day France and Germany, that particular region. And this was in 1635, so this is the first third of the 17th century. And his parents were staunch Lutherans, and Spener is a staunch Lutheran. His parents were wealthy, so they had money, and he was able to attend some of the best universities in Europe. So he is a guy who is well trained. In 1666, he is offered to the post of a pastor, for the pastor's post in Frankfurt, Germany, in the city of Frankfurt. And he has picked up over his studies what people refer to as mystic tendencies. Now, this isn't like, woo, mystic tendencies. He's kind of like, well, what does it look like? How does it feel? How does it work its way out in your life? Not just in your head. And so he's a guy who starts focusing on that is not just doctrine or head knowledge, but it's heart knowledge. And this is something that he is noted for, founding what he calls colleges of piety. And in this, he repeats his sermons, he expounds on the passages of the New Testament, and encourages those present to join the conversation and get involved. Now, if you're an academic, and there's nothing wrong with academics, but if you're an academic, you're studying the jots and tittles and every nuance and subtlety of doctrine, and you suddenly have this guy standing up saying, okay, folks, what do you guys think? Let's interact on this theology. Well, it's hard not to kind of get arrogant a little bit when you start thinking about, well, I've studied this my whole life. Who are these people? What do they know? Aren't they going to go off the beam? Because, man, I've studied this in detail, and I know how hard it is, so the rabble out here probably is not going to work so well. And unfortunately, that was kind of the attitude that started developing with a lot of people. Spener is saying, no. Let's interact. This should be part of your life too, not just the academic's life, not just the pastor's life. You need to understand how to interact with the text. You need to understand how to live out the gospel, if you will. Not just in being saved, justified, but being sanctified. Because the gospel is not just about justification, which is unfortunately what it has become synonymous with, even with us who say the gospel's more than that. We tend to think just in justification sense. He doesn't think this way. In 1675, Spener publishes a work referred to as an earnest desire to reform the true evangelical church, or Pia Desiteria. Now, isn't that funny? He calls the church the true evangelical church, and we just thought that was a modern term. So back in the 1600s, he's already saying the evangelical church. In other words, one that's going to be outreaching. And we're going to see the Pietists are actually going to have a great influence on missions because of their thinking about living out Christianity. Not to mention they're not running for their life as much. And this is where the term Pietists come from. Then people use this in a pejorative sense. We've seen that all the time. Whatever somebody uses as a pejorative with somebody, that usually ends up becoming their names, and they sort of take pride in that. It's kind of interesting how that all works. So whatever people start criticizing you for, that's probably going to become what you're noted for. Now, I do want to read through these sort of major 6 proposals. The proposals themselves, I think, are something that we can all can relate to, and I'm just going to give a short explanation. But in this writing, he points out 6 things. First off, men and women should study the Bible in small private sessions, which he referred to as little churches within the church. Now, what today would we call those little churches within the church where smaller groups are working together? Yeah, Bible studies, community groups, small groups, life groups, growth groups, things like that. There would be all sorts of those types of things. And basically he realizes that when you get together with a smaller group of people, you can interact and you can have sort of that life on life, that one anothering. And that is something that's really important. If we really think about it, throughout biblical history and church history, people are much better at interacting with smaller groups of people. You're sitting in a group of 200 or 300 or 500 and you're just listening. You're not interacting. There's no life on life. And if you then go, hey, see you next week, Joe, and you're off and out the door, what kind of growth can you really have? Because we need each other. Children need older kids, and older kids need teens, and teens need college kids, and we all need young families and parents and grandparents. We all need each other because we have to learn in the life on life. But we want to learn, of course, from the biblical perspective. So these types of things, he said, that's really important in the life of a church. And we see that as rediscovered today. And yet he pointed this out a long time ago. Due to the universality of the New Testament priesthood of believers, if you will, he says the laity should share in the government of the church along with the ordained clergy. And that all are God's priests, so therefore all ought to pursue lives of devotion and study and not simply leave it to the clergy. What he's basically saying, he's not saying, okay, everybody has to get an equal vote in governing the church. He's not talking about governance per se, even though later on some of these thoughts become part of more congregationalist movements because you get abuse by elders. But his thinking here is more along the lines of, look, if you sit back and say it's the pastor's job to do this, we're just all going to just sort of come show up and we're going to leave the ministry work, we're going to leave the study work, we're going to leave everything else about the church to the pastors, you miss the point. This is a body. Everybody's gifts need to be used, which is like what Paul said. The body is going to build up the body. And so his whole idea behind this was the New Testament saints are not just dependent on those who are their shepherds. The shepherds have a role. A pastor has a role. That's all we are. We're no better, no different, no worse. Well, hopefully no worse. But we're the ones that are supposed to lead and guide. That's our role. But we can't do all the work. It's not possible. We all know that. If you think that a pastor can do the work, you don't understand how frail humanity is. If you don't think you can do it, don't think a pastor can. Can't do it by themselves. And so he says, everybody needs to be involved. And every member ministry, if you will. Practicing the Christian life should be required of all men that claim to be Christians. Simple knowledge is not enough. Even pastors and clergy ought to be tested to ensure they're true Christians. Now, that's very interesting that he said, look, everybody's life ought to look this way. And just because you have a lot of knowledge in your head doesn't necessarily mean you're a Christian. There are people who know all about Christ but do not know Christ, who can quote doctrine inside out, upside down, and backwards, but they don't know their Savior. They can talk about their Savior, but they don't actually know Him. And he said, the clergy should be even tested. And what's fascinating is we're going to look a little bit later, John Wesley, in his own diary, by his own admission, says, I was out trying to convert people to faith, and I had none myself. So this is one of those things that Spinner recognized. And so he said, this is something that everybody's life ought to be looked at, tested, and evaluated. Next, he said, instead of attacks on non-believers, Christians should engage in sympathetic and kind treatment of them. Now, we see this today. We see this type of an idea that people, oh, well, I'm a Christian, you must be evil. Well, Paul writes about, yeah, you're a believer now, but here's a list of all the horrible things that used to be, and some were such of you. You guys were just as bad, so don't be looking down on folks. And that's a bad habit that people get into. Oh, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer. Oh, how terrible those people were. He said, no. Engage empathetically and sympathetically with grace and love and patience, because that is who we all are. And it was only by the grace of God that we have been saved. And therefore, we recognize who we are. We recognize what God has done for us. We understand these things. So we need to live in light of that. So it needs to be an empathy, not a harshness or an attack. It doesn't mean you have to agree. Oh yeah, sure, go ahead, kill people, that's good. No, but engage appropriately because we're all sinners. We're just saved sinners. And then he says, curriculum of the university should be adjusted. Notice the word adjusted, to give more prominence to the devotional lives of believers and not just theologic debate. Now, if you notice here, he is not a guy who is throwing out theology. He is not a guy who is throwing out precision. He is not a guy who is throwing out study and saying, oh, it's just about how you live and who cares about all this, theology stuff. He's saying, no, the emphasis and the adjustment should give more prominence to living out your life and not just debate. See, there's a big difference. See, he could have fallen off the edge and said, this theology stuff's bad. We don't need to study that because look at all the bad things that are happening. So that's kind of what the spiritualists did. They kind of went, well, I've got the Spirit. I don't need any of this knowledge. Throw it out. He's not saying that. Again, this is that balance. And we've talked about this before, but when you start thinking about the whole idea of, okay, somebody runs off the edge and you go, oh, that's bad. Your steps are not to turn and run from all of it. You should look at it and say, what's good about this? This is good and this is good and they got a point here. Now that part, no. That's where I need to stay away from. So learn from the good stuff and reject the bad stuff. So when you take a step, it maybe is only a half step away. Or maybe you go, I need to move a little closer to that because maybe I'm a little imbalanced. And so he said we need to have adjustments. And that's something we have to do in our life, all the time in our life. We're going to be having times where we're learning more, so we get a lot of knowledge in our head, and yet it hasn't worked out in our hearts. And there's other times we're going to be running and forgetting, oh yeah, I forgot, I haven't looked at my Bible in about 10 years. I probably need to study a little bit more. I need to know what it actually says, not just what I feel it says or think it says, but actually go back to what does it say. And this is again, in the universities, get that better balance between theology and devotional life. And that was one of the things he thought was important. And finally, preaching should major on faith and its fruits in people's lives instead of constantly expounding the latest theologic topics. And if you study theology, you know that there's always some new subtlety and some variance and some big issue. And if you get off on that, you're missing the main points, he's saying. It should be about faith and its fruits. What does faith look like and how do I live it? That doesn't say ignore theologic debate. You just don't spend all your time on it. You need to be aware of what's going on around you in theology because we've seen what has happened in church history. Things have changed and shifted and little subtleties become big errors later on. So you do have to pay attention to it, but that's not the emphasis. That's not the sole thing. Just like you can overemphasize practice and forget about sanctification and you forget about justification. Or you can emphasize we're just preaching the same gospel message every week and we forgot that, hey, this is supposed to grow up the saints. And imbalance in any way, shape, or form creates a problem. So if you notice here, what Spinner's laying out is very biblical, very practical, and very balanced. And that's why the Pietist movements, if you will, were very successful in reaching to people. Now later on, of course, like anything, things go off beam or wander away or splinter groups form. And, that's just kind of the way life is. Because we're all like that. It's going to happen here. It's going to happen wherever you are. Now, Spinner was, though, a Lutheran at heart. He did not reject the doctrines or the teachings, the core things about Lutheranism. His arguments were based in the theological precision, but it needed to be applied practically. Now, a lot of Lutherans went, "Oh, thank you. This is where my heart is." And other people are going, "I'm not so crazy about this guy." Especially a lot of the wealthy people, because wealthy people, it would be really easy for them to go, "I go to church, I know the doctrine, and I can live how I want." And that's not how it should be. And so some people are crazy about it. And as I mentioned earlier, when you start taking Bible study and the emphasis on studying the Bible and not theology, because those are different things, related, but if you're worrying about debates and you're worrying about theology, all those different things, and you forget about the practice and the application of it, if you will, the seminary, the professor kind of folks are going, "Oh, I'm not so sure about this. And it's kind of a little bit not my favorite. So Spinner, you're causing some trouble here." So he wasn't well liked by everybody. Some people thought he was pretty good, but others weren't crazy about him. Now, the other thing, and this might sound a little crazy, but true, the Lutherans and the Reformed group, and we've talked about Lutheran Orthodoxy and Reformed Orthodoxy and sort of the variations and a little bit of differences there. The Lutherans and the Reformed folks, or Calvinists, if you will, didn't get along real great even at this point. Matter of fact, it was probably more divergence between them than during Calvin and Melanchthon and Luther's and Zwingli's time. And the way Spinner's talking as a Orthodox Lutheran sounds far more like John Calvin. And therefore, they're even looking at him going, "Are you sure you're Lutheran? Because you sound like John Calvin. You sound like a Reformed guy." And so he gets criticism from there. And he even got the University of Wittenberg laid 264 charges of error against him. So again, Wittenberg, this is the foundation of Lutheranism. Now, one of the things that you have to also realize is it's very easy for anybody to go off beam a little bit. And because of his a little bit more, if you will, mystic tendencies, it led him into what is referred to as apocalypticism, whatever. He emphasized too much about revelation and the end time stuff. He got all off onto that. And people are like, "Where are you coming up with this stuff? And what's really going on?" So it's easy to point fingers and pick at something, because if somebody overemphasizes something that you're not real sure about, it's very easy then to dismiss everything else he says. So unfortunately, he kind of drifted off into that realm, and that kind of hurt him. Now, something that is important for the next guy, Franca, is he continues to write and defends his position until 1705 when he dies. He was born in, remember, 1635, dies in 1705. But he established the University of Halle. And this was one that he established, and people who are pietistic, he sort of continued in their leadership. And this is going to be really, really important, because we're going to see some of the pietistic movement in the next generation come through this university and some of the practical application of it. And that's going to lead us to the next gentleman. His name is August Hermann Franca. And he was a follower of Spinner. So he was sort of the next generation or next wave. And he ends up in one of the chairs of the University of Halle. Spinner, or Franca, who was like Spinner, studied at great universities of his time. So he had a good theologic background, a good, if you will, humanistic background, because that was, again, during this particular time. And he ended up under the influence of a pietist named Christian Kortholt. And he emphasized and helped organize small groups which focused on Bible study. And Franca took a special interest in Greek and Hebrew. So what's really interesting is he is a guy who is Hebrew and Greek scholar and studying it from a literary form and all the other aspects. So he's down in the weeds of the languages, and yet he says, but even when I get down in the weeds of the languages, I should be applying it to life and living based on what I'm learning from it. So he doesn't throw scholarship out at all. Matter of fact, he's a great scholar. We're going to see in a second He's teaching orphans and people in his school for children Greek and Hebrew and biblical exegesis. Think about that. This guy is that dedicated to academics and yet practical Christian living. They both have to be there. So Franke, again, believes in this heartfelt religion. He doesn't share Spinner's eschatological viewpoints, and he insisted on joy in the Christian life. In other words, the joy, the Christian life should not be, as they say, the lemon-sucking Christian. Ooh. He said there should be joy in your life. Yeah, there's going to be hard. Yes, there's going to be difficult. Yes, there's going to be hardship. But joy should be produced by what we know and how we live, because it's about the Lord and about his people and about serving God and others. And so he looks at it from a very different perspective. Now, in 1689, and if you're a creeds and confession person, 1689 is the London Baptist Confession of 1689. A lot of Reformed groups hold to that particular confession. But in 1689, he is preaching exegetically and practically from the Bible. He becomes a very popular speaker because he's very evangelistic, but he's also very practical. People understand. And he's doing this in the city of Leipzig, and he's thrown out, but he goes and takes a position in Erfurt. And that position in Erfurt lasts a grand total of 15 months, and people love to hear him. Even Roman Catholics are being converted by his preaching. But people don't like him because he doesn't sound like the Lutheran orthodoxy. And so in 1691, he's commanded by the city officials to leave within 48 hours. How about that for a quick move? So he goes and joins Spinner at the University of Halle, and he works as the professor of Greek and Oriental languages. So in other words, he is an academic. He eventually also starts teaching theology. But since that position offered no pay, he, for 36 years, or the next 36 years, was also a pastor of a local church. So he is a pastor and a professor for 36 years, teaching and reaching out to folks. And as I mentioned, one of the things he did is he had a heart for orphans. That does not mean that, okay, because he did it, we have to do it. Because too many people go, oh, we got to have an orphanage, and we got to have this, and we got to have this. No, the whole heart of this was there's a need, and here's orphans, and I want to take care of them because I want to live out my faith. And so he is a guy who starts this and a school. And this is a charity-funded school, and that was in 1695. It grows quickly. And by 1698, he has 100 orphans and 500 other students attending his school on a daily basis. And as I mentioned, they're learning Hebrew, Greek, and biblical exposition. Not your typical things that children learn in school today, but that's how much he cared about knowing and living the Bible. One of the things, though, is the Pietists really re-energized the notion of missions. Now, we know that during the quote-unquote Dark Ages, the Catholic Church had missions through the monks and the monasteries, and they were reaching out into different people and all, and they were trying to do stuff. Even in the quote-unquote world expansion, it was gold and glory in God. Those are kind of the three driving things that, when the Portuguese and the Spanish went out. But part of it was, I want to convert people. So they sent priests as well as conquerors, and people wanted money from those lands. But here, the Pietists, sort of after this struggle for justification and start seeing sanctification, they begin to realize we need to reach out around the rest of the world. And what happens here, and this is actually started by the King of Denmark in 1707, he was an admirer of the Pietists, and he decided that he wanted to send some missionaries to colonies in India. So this is the guy who kind of kicks it off. And he finds nobody in the Dutch church willing to do that. It's like, no, we're not going. We're happy right here. And so he turns to some of the Pietists, and he talks with Franke. And Franke sends a Bartholomäus Ziegenblog and Heinrich Plutschau. Much easier to say Hudson Taylor than that. But if you speak I'm not sure whether that's going to be a German or Dutch, but they're same Germanic language base. He sends them to India. And these guys are, if you will, the first official Protestant missionaries to India. He establishes a mission in basically southeastern India in the Tamil region. And that's one of the languages that's spoken in India besides Hindi is Tamil. We actually know some people that, work with some of the Tamil groups. And this guy, by 1719, by the age of 36, okay, he's 36 years old, he left behind a dictionary and grammar in Tamil. He had translations of the New Testament and the Old Testament up to the book of Ruth, several tracts and other things, 2 church buildings, a seminary for training indigenous clergy, and over 250 Indians have been baptized. And, that is quite impressive as a start. And if you notice, he said, we're going to train the locals and let the locals go. If that trend had continued, we probably wouldn't have to be sending missionaries out because we would already train them and they would be doing that. Matter of fact, they'd be sending missionaries back our way because we're going to need them. What happens, though, is as people find out about what's going on, this spreads across Germany, and the Pietists then go, this is a really good thing. We need to be doing this. And so by 1714, they set up a school, besides what's going on at University of Halle, they set up a school for missionaries in Copenhagen. Now, this isn't just, I want to be a missionary. These people were trained, understood the Bible, vetted, all the different things that goes along with it. This wasn't just, hey, I want to go save the world. These people had some seriousness behind them. And between the Danish Missionary Society and the Moravian Church, which we're going to talk about next, they continue to send people all over the world, including Greenland, India, and even to the Jews in Israel or other places. So this leads us now to Nicholas Ludwig Zinzendorf and the Moravian Church. Now, Zinzendorf was a count, and he ends up being a guy who is going to be noted for founding the Moravian Church. Though the reality is he wasn't the founder of it. He's kind of the organizer of what had been the followers of John Huss. We're going to talk about that in a second. First off, Zinzendorf was born to a very devout Lutheran family in Nuremberg, Germany, and Jacob Spinner was his godfather. So you see there's a relationship here. Zinzendorf was trained at the University of Halle, and he had a very pietistic influence in his life. He studied law at Wittenberg, so he was a very well-educated man. He travels sort of as a diplomat in the Netherlands, France, and various parts of Germany, and he likes to talk with people about their faith and their religion and how they live out their life. Now, Franke had invited Zinzendorf to take over the orphanage at Halle, but in deference to his family, he said, I really need to, instead of taking care of this orphanage, I need to take care of the lands and the family holdings and the people that are under my influence, because his family it was a wealthy family, and so he had responsibilities there. And so he does this, and he wants to then take these practices that he's learned and bring them to those people and sort of help enliven, if you will, both the people in the area, the church in the area. And so he gets together and he calls men to pray together. He purchases large quantities of Bibles and tracts and books and catechisms and hymnals and all sorts of stuff that people can reach out into their community and learn and grow, just very much like the whole pietist idea. Now, Zinzendorf also challenged the growing rationalism in the area, and he wants to present Christ as the revelation of the Father, complete and accurate in time. But he also wants us to understand and help these people realize that Christianity is not just about a series of doctrines. It's a life. It's a relationship. And it's something that your brain needs to engage in. So he's not saying, hey, rationalists, you're crazy, you can't use your brain. Because, some of them are looking around going, do you Christians actually use your brains? And he's saying, no, it's a reasoned faith. All right, I agree with you. Use your brain. But it's not man's judgment. It's God's judgment. So look at the Bible, look at Christ in those terms. Not just cold doctrines, not just spiritual stuff, but the joining of faith and reason together. That my faith is reasoned, but it's still faith. So he tries to challenge those kinds of ideas. Zinzendorf also had a little bit of an idea that, maybe the church and the state shouldn't be quite so bound together. So the church is being bound and held by the state. And we're going to see later on with Wesley and other people, because of the way the Anglican church is set up under the government, there's a problem. The Lutheran church is the same way. So Zinzendorf saying maybe there should be a little bit more freedom here in the separation so we can worship individually. Now, how Zinzendorf gets involved with the Moravians or the founding of the Moravians is some of these folks come to the town of, or he helps establish the town of Herrnhut in his area. And these folks were actually followers of John Huss. And if you remember back a long time ago, we talked about Huss being driven from England in the 14th, 15th century. He was, if you will, a Protestant reformer before there was the Protestant Reformation. Huss was eventually killed under the Council of Constance in 1415, if you remember some of that stuff. And these people had been sort of persecuted during this time period, and so they sort of split and splintered, and they had a little divergent views amongst themselves, but they really were very, I don't know what you'd call them. They're kind of a church without being a church, but they were very Protestant long before Protestantism. Zinzendorf sort of pulls them together, and more Moravians arrive, and he gets them sort of organized. And so you basically end up with this Moravian church that's established that he's there. Now that creates some tension with, of course, some of the locals and others because of the Peace of Augsburg, and because, of course, the Lutherans weren't real crazy about things that they weren't in charge of. So there's some issues even there. Even a guy trying to just organize stuff and help people out, there's problems that he has to deal with. Now, he eventually is made a bishop of this church in 1737, but again, he wasn't trying this. He just ends up kind of falling into it. In 1731, though, Zinzendorf met with a group of Inuit that had been converted by a Lutheran missionary. And one of the things, I've mentioned that the pietistic movement sort of fostered a lot of missionary work, but that does not mean they were the only missionaries out there. We know that was happening in the Catholic Church with Spain and Portugal and things like that. And here we see there were some Lutherans out there being missional minded. Now, Zinzendorf does sort of reach out and help establish different areas, different towns, and one of them is the town of Bethlehem, and the other one is the town of Nazareth. But guess where they are? They're not in Israel. They are in the future state or current colony of Pennsylvania. And Bethlehem Steel and things like that. Well, the Moravians under Zinzendorf are the ones who established those towns. Also, there's a town that many of you might know today in North Carolina called Winston-Salem. Well, the Salem portion of Winston-Salem, like the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Dallas, Fort Worth, Winston-Salem, the Salem part was founded by the Moravians and under Zinzendorf. So he was somebody who established towns in those areas. And if you also remember, we talked about William Penn, Pennsylvania. He wanted religious freedom, and the Moravians and many other persecuted groups came to Pennsylvania and established towns and participated in the whole governance and practice of the state. So Zinzendorf was a guy who was reaching, missional-minded, sent folks out, really tried to help things out like that. Now, he is a guy who has a problem with working things out very well, if that makes any sense at all. He is somebody who doesn't allow his holdings to be managed well. Even though he's reached out, he's helped them, he's done all this stuff, Zinzendorf ends up having to take out loans. He almost goes bankrupt, and he kind of dies in 1760 after his son, who was a wayward son, in 1752, and his wife in 1760 or 1756 kind of is depressed and sort of dies. I mean, so very energetic man, very caring man, very organizing man. Unfortunately, he kind of, as he wanted to keep the home front burning kind of through circumstance left the home front not doing well. And that's a lesson learned for any of us. Ministering for God to his people can be detrimental to the point of you actually don't take care of the things God's already given you first priority in your home and family and things like that. So Zinzendorf is a guy who basically helps establish a Moravian church, is missional minded, establishes things, gets things rolling with that whole idea. And the Moravians are now going to have an influence, or a very significant influence, on the next guy we're going to talk about, and that's John Wesley and the Methodists. Now, Wesley is a guy who was born in 1703, so he's a little bit younger than Zinzendorf and Franke and Spina and all those guys. His dad was Samuel and his mom Susanna. He was the 15th of 19 children, of only which 7 survived, and many people have read about them. Samuel Wesley was a rector in the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And at age 5, Wesley was rescued from a fire, and he felt that this must mean God has some purpose for his life. Well, many people think, well, gosh, maybe God has some special purpose for my life. Well, he does. Every moment you have a breath, everything that you do, every second he permits you to live, he has a purpose for it. So maybe it's not as dramatic as being saved from a fire, therefore I have a purpose in life. It's you have a purpose in life. God has given it to you, regardless of where you are, what age you are. So sometimes people are affected profoundly by profound events, but we should be perfected profoundly because we have a gospel, we have a faith, we have a life that God has given each and every one of us. So even though Wesley kind of sort of saw a little special hand there, we have that same hand upon us. We just may not see it quite as clearly as that. Now, as he learned to read at an early age, he went to school in London. He practices a methodical religion. I wonder where the Methodists are going to get their name from. Well, he's influenced by a book by Thomas à Kempis called The Imitation of Christ. Got some really good information in there, and it's to live a holy life dedicated to God. When he's at Oxford University, he distinguishes himself as a scholar. So Wesley's very, very well educated, and he's a very devout young man. His brother Charles, as many of you know, the both pastor and hymn writer, if you will, and his friends at Oxford, including a gentleman named George Whitefield. Heard of him before. George Whitefield establishes a group of guys that get together. They want to live a sober and holy life. And they promise to meet once a week for communion, remain faithful in their private devotions, visit prisons regularly, and meet every day for 3 hours to study the Bible and other devotional books. Their friends, the people in Oxford, their friends, quote unquote, call them and mock them as they're the Holy Club. And due to their methodical pattern of meeting and getting together and what they did, they were referred to as the Methodists. And so again, a pejorative that people are called ends up becoming what eventually we're going to see comes the Methodist Church. Now, as I mentioned, Zinzendorf and the Moravians are going to actually have a tremendous influence upon John Wesley, because in 1735, if you notice, this is about the same time Zinzendorf is trying to reach out to the Inuits, and before he becomes a bishop in the Moravian Church, he and his brother Charles decide to go to the city of Savannah, Georgia, in the American colonies. And at this time, James Oglethorpe is the governor of the colony. And if you remember from your American history that Georgia was kind of set up as a penal colony, and after the American Revolution, Australia, Botany Bay, if my memory serves me, ends up becoming a new penal colony there. But he wants to go across. He wants to be a pastor of a church. He wants to reach out to the Native Americans. But on his trip across the Atlantic, he runs across these Moravians, and he sees their life as much more pious, if you will. There's something about them that's just like, what is it about these guys that I don't have? Now, during this trip, there's this massive storm that strikes, and the main mast of the ship is broken. The crewmen are panicking. He is panicking, and the Moravians are calm, singing and praying. And he's like, who are these people? Are they crazy, or do they have something I don't have? And so after this, he's kind of convinced there's something he lacks. And so he starts talking with the Moravians, and in particular a guy named Spangenberg, and he seeks his advice on several times. And this is what he writes in his journal. So I'm going to just read this from his journal. So it says he, and that's Spangenberg, said, "My brother, I must first ask you one or two questions. Have you the witness within you? Does the Spirit of God bear witness to your spirit that you are a child of God?" He says, "I was surprised and knew not how to answer." He says, "He observed it and asked, 'Do you know Jesus Christ?' And I paused and said, 'I know he's the Savior of the world.' 'True,' he replied, 'but do you know he has saved you?' And I answered, 'I hope he's died to save me.' He only added, 'Do you know yourself?' I said, I do." But Wesley adds in his journal, "But I fear they were vain words." In other words, he's going, I'm not sure I can say that. Not sure I can really say that. And this is something that Wesley's later on in his life is, he's going to find out. He's going to say, I went out to save people when I wasn't even saved. And we're going to see that he's going to begin to understand what this Moravian guy asked him is true in his life a little bit later. Now, I'm going to kind of short circuit some things because his time in Georgia was not successful, nor was it pleasant. He tried to reach out to the Native Americans, and that didn't go well. And he tried to create his little holy club group like he had in Oxford, and the people there were like, "What are you talking about? I come to church, I'm going to do my thing, I'm out of here." People weren't particularly interested in that. They want, "Here, lead us through the rituals and we're done." And he's kind of like, but what happened to a holy life? What happened to being godly? He also happens to have a romantic challenge, a break off of an engagement. There's a lawsuit. There's a defamation. There's problems between Wesley and the family by all sorts of stuff. The whole thing ends up at a big mistrial, and Wesley returns back to England. Now, after 3 years in Georgia, he hadn't solved much of anything. And so he kind of turns to the local Moravian church. He goes, there's something about these guys. I'm going to go back and talk with them. And he writes this in his journal. He says, "In the evening, I went very unwillingly to the society in Aldersgate Street, where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while the leader was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given to me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." So, you now realize, he says, now I get what that guy was asking me. I realize that God's Spirit is testifying to me, I really am saved. Christ really did die for me. And again, that's where he writes later in his journal that while I was trying to go to save people, I myself was not converted. It was kind of an interesting revelation. And that goes back to, remember we talked earlier that the clergy needs to test that whether they just because they know a lot doesn't mean that they really are saved. And here is a perfect example of Wesley admitting that. Now, Wesley tries to ally himself with the Moravian church. He even goes to Herrnhut and in 1738. But when he goes back to England, he finds out that there's not a lot of opportunities to preach in parish churches. And his friend George Whitefield had encountered similar circumstances in, preaching opportunities. Whitefield, however, took the approach of, I'm going to go make my own pulpit. So he stuck it out in the field and started preaching to miners in Bristol. And Whitefield continues to gain prestige, splitting time between Georgia and England. Wesley wasn't real crazy about open-air preaching up until he was converted, and later on he goes, man, maybe it is reaching people. Maybe there's something to what they're doing. And so he follows Whitefield's lead, and he was rejected by the established church because now he's doing something that's not within the church. However, unlike Whitefield, Wesley never really feels comfortable. Different people have different gifts and different things. Whitefield, that was a good thing for him. Wesley, not so much. And Wesley really wanted to remain in the Anglican church. He still felt that that's how God was working through things. But when he comes back from Herrnhut, he tries to hook up with some Moravians in London and to help them organize and get things going and meeting. And he and Whitfield and a couple of other folks, his brother Charles, they're really excited about stuff, and they're joyous about what's going on. But unfortunately, some of the Moravians start slipping into what's referred to as quietism. That's not something. It's something we haven't talked about. But let me just read from the notes here, so you kind of get an idea of the way the people thought about what being a quietist is. Kind of the Shakers and Quaker type of idea, mostly the Shakers. But it says, to them, full assurance of faith should automatically accompany salvation. Any doubt or fear experienced by a professing believer was indicative of a need of salvation. Therefore, they should be preach that should one ever doubt or fear, he should stop all good works, abstain from the means of grace, and remain quiet before God until he is restored to faith to that individual. Therefore, the means of grace, after all, were gifts to believers. So, if you're doubting or fearful, you probably aren't saved and shouldn't take part in the means of grace. Well, Wesley said, I don't think so. He preaches a couple of sermons against that, and he gets kicked out. So about 50 people go with him, and his alliance with the Moravians kind of die after that. Now, Wesley was a very devout man. He was a very man of the book, if you will, believer in the Scriptures. So his theology was a little bit different. Whitfield and he take sort of a different path. And again, we're not going to go into any of the major details, but Wesley was not Calvinistic when it came to God's grace and salvation, etc. However, like we've sort of talked about before, in practice they kind of look the same. But Wesley, along with sort of the Arminian view, is God has given grace to all men, and therefore they have the ability, because of God's grace, to choose or not choose to believe. And so this is that idea that outside of God's grace, nobody could be saved, but God has given grace to all men. The Calvinistic view is, no, God's grace has been given to the elect, and therefore when they are given that grace, they will choose. Therefore, the grace is irresistible. In a Wesleyan view, grace is resistible. In practice, you can't see the difference between the two. You either believe or you don't. What was the mechanism behind it? That's a theological discussion. Again, not part of this class. But he and Whitfield kind of went at it over time about this idea. But Wesley does say that once a personal faith has been exercised, there would be an inward impression on the soul of the believers whereby God's Spirit, the Spirit of God, directly testifies to the Spirit that they are the children of God. So in other words, he says, I get what the Moravian guy asked me because I know God's Spirit is testifying to my spirit that I am a child of God. Yes, I might stumble. Yes, I might have questions at times, but I am God's child. So this whole debate in practice, there's not a tremendous amount of difference. Now there are theological fallouts of it, but again, not part of this class. Wesley also in sanctification, because remember we said that part of the pietistic leanings were, what does your life look like? Sanctification. He said we should strive to be perfect in love. Now again, this is not sinless perfectionism, which is what the holiness movement later on is going to take up, and that's kind of runs off the cliff the other direction. He says to be perfect in love was to have one's motives guided by a deep desire to please God. In other words, love for God, per the first great commandment. Therefore, a person could sin, but instead would choose to follow God's laws, commandments, and therefore intentionally avoid sin. In other words, his heart is for love for God and will leave out intentionally trying to avoid sin. The second, that the believer leaves the believer to focus on loving your neighbor per the second great commandment. Love your neighbor, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Second great commandment. Therefore, one measure of your life would be the degree which you are engaging in serving those around you. Wesley encourages followers to be active in their communities, sending missionaries, and protecting the needy. In other words, living a Christian life in life. And that's not just coming to church, putting stuff in your head, and walking out. So again, a life that came along with this. Now, How in the world did the Methodist Church come about? Well, Wesley did not want to establish a separate church. That was never his intention, but he kind of gradually, step by step, gets kind of forced into it. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the details in your notes, but I'm going to kind of give you a sort of a flyover of what ends up happening. And a lot of the final break comes in the American Revolution time period, but let's just sort of walk through some of the ideas. Now, first off, as the Methodist meetings, they continued to do this stuff. They sort of formed societies, and when those societies got too big, they had classes. They had classes of 11 students and one leader, and they got together. There's that small group idea. They got together. They weren't ordained. They didn't do the traditional church things, the sacraments, baptism, communion type of things. But they did end up with some people becoming what you call lay preachers. They weren't quote-unquote ordained clergy, but they became lay preachers in this whole thing. And that didn't go over real well with the Anglican Church, as you can imagine. And people kind of got on to Wesley about it. But Wesley kept saying, no, we're not a church. We're not separate. We're not going to have any of our meetings during the time when people should be in church. They should go to the Anglican Church. The ceremonies or the liturgy has value. And again, if you understand what they're trying to do, there is value in it. I'm not a big liturgical person, but a lot of people, if they understand it, it works out for them. Wesley was a guy like that. He said, hey, there's value in this. Now, what ends up happening, though, is the movement continues to grow and continues to get bigger, and there continues to be greater and greater contention. And Wesley just fights that, you got to stay in the church. But in 1746, he changes his mind and decides, that apostolic succession stuff in the Anglican Church, I'm not even sure that's right. I don't think that's really that much. So Wesley becomes convicted biblically that bishops were the same as presbyters and elders, and therefore any elder could ordain ministers. And if he was a minister, he could ordain ministers. So he's not worried about the apostolic succession. It was like, if you're an elder, you can ordain other elders, because that's kind of how the church kind of worked. He had that the hierarchy of the church was serious, but he tried to be careful about how that all played out, and we're not going to go into more details than that. But Wesley gets pressed initially by the American Revolution, and this is going to force his hand. During the American Revolution, people who were Anglican were in the Anglican Church, but most, not all, but most of the Anglican pastors went, I'm under the crown. I have to submit here to the governmental authority. Even if I sympathize with you, I can't stay here and do this. You're rebels. So most of them left. And what does this do? Well, you've got this Methodist group, and you've got these lay preachers, and you've got no clergy. And after the American Revolution, the British government doesn't accept the Americans, if you will. And so guess what? The Anglican Church will not ordain any Anglicans to come to be pastors. So Wesley goes, well, what do we do? All right, well, I guess we're going to have to become those that ordain and establish churches and go for it. So by 1784, he's ordaining ministers, and he sends two of them, along with an Anglican priest who is a superintendent, basically a bishop, and he overrides the authority of the Anglican Church now. And by doing that, he basically sets himself up as a separate group. And he does this not only in America, but in Scotland and other places. And in 1787, he finally says, I am registering the Methodist as a separate church from the Church of England. So the Methodist Church is now officially set up. And this is how all of this sort of transpires. Again, Wesley is not trying to usurp authority, but it's kind of like, there's no authority, I got to do something. That's what he ends up doing. The other thing about the Methodists, and if Wesley wasn't successful in what he did, it wouldn't be a big deal. But because the Anglican Church was not very well equipped for the Industrial Revolution and adapting to the situation, putting churches and ordained clergy and all that kind of stuff, the Methodists kind of stepped in and just sort of, well, let's get together and let's start learning and reaching out. And they were able to reach out, just like Whitefield was to those miners. The same thing, but in the opposite effect, happened in America. There wasn't a lot of big cities. Everything was spread out so much, so they ended up with sort of the circuit riders, pastors, lay preachers going around and preaching in these small communities. So they were very effective, along with the Baptists, doing that same type of stuff in North America. And so the Industrial Revolution in England with the big cities, the church was not able to adapt. And the rural situation in America, the church was not able to adapt. The Methodists were. And therefore, they were successful. Therefore, that's why there was the press, if you will, to reach out and become its own, if you will, church. Now, later on, Wesley travels between Europe and the U.S., and one biographer wrote that he rode 250,000 miles, gave away 30,000 pounds, and preached more than 40,000 sermons. And he continues to form churches, commission preachers, administers charities and orphanages. So he's very, very active his whole life. One little known fact about the guy is he also wrote a writing in 1760 on the electricity made plain and useful by a lover of mankind and of the common sense. He basically, a lot of people think of him as sort of a early practitioner of electroshock therapy. Now, again, there's some goods and bads about all that stuff, but it's interesting. A guy has a fascination with electricity because that was kind of a new thing at the time, and he actually writes on that. It's kind of a, if you will, a hobby. He was kind of one of those guys that, all of us have our own hobbies, our own life. We just think of people in little boxes, but he actually had some other interests. Now, one other thing that I just want to bring up, Whitefield and he sort of, like I said, took sort of a different path when it comes to the understanding of how grace is applied. Whitefield stayed Calvinistic. Wesley went more Arminian. And they kind of took shots across the bow with each other for a while. Early on, Wesley said, hey, if you're Calvinistic, that's a blasphemous understanding about predestination. And Whitefield wrote against Wesley on this stuff. And in 1741, so a long time before they died, they kind of separated paths. And Whitefield established the Calvinistic Methodist movement or tradition. Now, later on, though, Whitefield and Wesley kind of reconciled. They kind of went, maybe we shouldn't be fighting over this stuff. And Wesley writes in a memorial sermon to praise Whitefield's admirable qualities. He declared, there are many doctrines of less essential nature. In these we may think and let think. We may agree to disagree. But in the meantime, let us hold fast to the essentials. So the essentials, you're going to preach the gospel and people are going to believe and they're going to live or not. All of the mechanisms behind it, okay, we may agree to disagree on. Wesley was also an abolitionist. He did not agree with slavery and he worked towards abolition. And when he dies in 1791 at the age of 87, it's been said that when John Wesley was carried to his grave, he left behind him a good library of books, a well-worn clergyman's gown, and the Methodist Church. So we can now see that the pietistic movement is kind of trying to regain that stability. And all movements tend to work through processes, and we're gonna watch fighting for core things, and then fighting in doctrine, and then making sure things are put together well. And the pietists kind of try to pull them all back together. And of course, what's going to happen is other things are going to start working on them, and we're going to see a fragmentation through liberalism and how the rationalistic stuff takes effect, and a whole bunch of other things. But realize that these guys really tried to say, study hard, know your scriptures, know your Bible, be involved in people's lives, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, and it ought to look like that. And it's not just about the clergy, it's about the church. Clergy happen to have a role in it, but the people have to be part of it. And these are things that I think we all can resonate to. If we just sit back in our church and say, the pastor's supposed to do that, or the pastor goes, I'm not doing anything, I'm just hanging out here and you guys take care of it, everybody loses out. We also see that these guys cared about others. They cared about their neighbors. They cared about the lost. They cared about reaching out to others in missions work. All of them did well, but you also can see that they weren't perfect either. None of us are, and that's where that grace has to come in. Just like Wesley and Whitefield kind of got into it, they eventually reconciled to it. And maybe this isn't something to die on. So a lot of things that we can learn from these guys, from these movements, from these different ways of how to fall off the edge. Matter of fact, I think that's probably the greatest lesson I've ever learned when I teach church history is there's a platform to stay on, and there's a lot of edges you can fall off really easily if we're not careful. So again, let's grab hold of each other as we see each other going off in the edge and pull each other back. And remember, I want to try to get back in that beautiful balance of loving the Lord and His people and all men, if you will. And we can learn a lot from all these folks.